Starting us off, though, a look at a topic that has been picking up attention over the last few weeks: the relationship between football clubs and betting companies.
Yeah, so this is a topic I'm quite interested to talk to you about because it's connected to a few things we have going on outside of the game right now, as well, of course, as the discussion we had about Kieran Trippier, because this has been sort of invoked to talk about it, and how the relationship between football teams and football organisations, are they beneficial towards betting companies? Do they have an equal balance? One of the things that's brought it to the forefront has come from Gary Lineker, who has been talking about how several football teams in the Premiership and the Championship have betting companies as their partners. And the second is the upcoming review of the 2005 Gambling Act by the government here in the UK, which could change the way betting laws operate in this country. So just to start off and to put this conversation in the right kind of context, I want to kind of place gambling and its presence in the football industry, because if we're going to discuss whether something has too much or an acceptable amount of influence, it's good to pinpoint exactly how much influence it has to begin with. So just looking at the Premier League to kick us off, 10 out of 20 Prem sides have gambling shirt sponsors. Those are West Ham, Wolves, Burnley, Southampton, Leeds, Palace, Newcastle and Fulham that have them on the front of their shirt, whilst Aston Villa and West Brom have gambling firms on their shirt sleeves. The issue is even more pervasive in the Championship, where 17 of the 24 clubs have a betting logo on the shirt. Of course, as highlighted by Gary Lineker, beyond just shirt sponsors, several teams have gambling partners and will promote these via their social media platforms before a match, even going as far as suggest bets. So Man City have been called out for this, Leicester have been called out for this, Arsenal have been called out for this, sort of saying things along the lines of, "Oh, our captain Aubameyang's back this week and he's in really good form, you should bet on him to score 2 against Southampton because that's what he did last season." And there's been a bit of a zeroing in on this because it's been suggested by some, and Gary Lineker is one of these, that it's a little bit predatory. Ruben, what are your thoughts on whether or not this is a fair promotion with a team that's looking to bring in some revenue into an audience that is predisposed towards sports betting, or if this is sort of not on?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting discussion, and the reason why it's going to get more complicated is because it can't be as cut and dry as gambling is bad and shouldn't be in the game, because this comes at a time where football clubs need the revenue from sponsorships now more than ever. So the other statistics that I want to throw out at the beginning of the conversation, just before we get into the nitty gritty, is that betting on certain online platforms has increased by 25% during lockdown. And not only that, the number of gambling sessions lasting more than an hour has increased by 23% year on year. So this is still a growing market, and it's something that's very much growing in football, as evidenced by not only the fact that 10 out of 20 Premier League clubs are sponsored by football by betting companies, but that in 2000 it was 0. So clearly there's been a big push for that. And I think that you've touched on a really important point there, which is that it's almost more prevalent in the Championship, in 17 clubs.
Well, the Sky Bet Championship, as it's known.
Exactly, yes. So the point that I want to make here, firstly, is that what betting companies have been trying to do for the last 20 years is to position themselves as a key part of the matchday experience. And the reason why they've pushed more heavily into the Championship is because the Championship is more typically made up of diehard fans that will go to every game, every away game, whereas the Premier League is slightly diluted by the fact that it's so international and the fact that it's so popular for people outside of, the areas in which the clubs reside.
Right, makes sense.
So, when I think about, or when a lot of people think about, their match day experience, they think about the football, they think about beer and alcohol, because that is also really prevalent within, advertising and things. And they think about gambling. Gambling's very much right there. You see it in Gillette Soccer Saturday. You see it in every single advert at halftime. You see it on the shirts themselves. You can't escape it, even if you're watching the BBC. So, personally, it's just going to be a really interesting thing to see how it turns out, because I also feel like you can't just blanket deny clubs their sponsorship revenues. I think that it needs to be phased out, essentially, but that maybe more not more rational measures, but more subtle measures need to be taken during lockdown to make sure that people aren't, risking their livelihoods week in, week out, which is something that is becoming increasingly more prevalent.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's very important to maybe divide this conversation into two parts, because I think one part of this discussion is very, very nuanced and really takes on the larger conversation beyond even football of what right do you have to do something as an adult? Do you smoking, drinking, gambling, all that sort of stuff. It might be quote unquote bad for you, but do you have a reasonable right to throw your entire self into it because you have your own agency? And the other is how kids get involved into it, because football ultimately is something that attracts crowds of all ages. A lot of kids grow up watching football, and if betting is a massive force in that, does that provide a bad influence into kids growing up? And I just want to start off with that second part, just because I slightly think it's a little bit more easy to be, generalizing and black and white when we're talking about children. And that's talking about how much betting is shown in the game and to what point it's become sort of, as you said, part of the match day experience and part of the experience of football in general. Obviously, we've talked about all these teams that are sponsored by betting companies, and the Sky Bet Championship being a betting company. For example, Stoke City are a team that are owned by a family, the Coates family, who also own Bet365. So they play at the Bet365 family. There was a story about a young 3-year-old West Ham fan who named his teddy bear Betway recently, because he's sort of grown up seeing that on the show all the time.
Yeah, which is wild.
Which is wild. And actually, the what was the name of this? It was the Gambling Commission actually found that 14% of 11 to 16-year-olds had spent their own money on gambling in the previous week. And in the UK, around 55,000 children in the UK are actually addicted to gambling, which is a figure that has quadrupled in the last 2 years and prompted the NHS to open its first gambling clinic for children. That's pretty harrowing to think, right? 55,000 children actively addicted to gambling, which is insane. And I think that part of that is because gambling has become so much more accessible. When you and I were growing up, gambling was still a thing in football. It was still a huge market, but it was very much something you had to be involved in. You would go down to the betting shop on the high street physically, and even that was sort of its own protected zone, and you would have to have a bit of the savoir-faire and the know-how to place all these bets. Now you can be sat on your sofa, especially during lockdown, tap, 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 and you've put 50 quid on. And I think, at least, I think we might have a very interesting two-part nuanced discussion when it comes to adults, but at least with the kids, I'm sure we can agree that this is something that needs to be combated.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that it's obvious that this space needs to be regulated in a way that other things are regulated. You're not allowed to, like, a lot of content is censored for kids, and betting isn't at all. And we're obviously seeing this massive rise, and it's really worrying. And you hate to hear those kind of numbers coming out.
Well, except that betting is supposed to, which is part of why the discussion about betting in football is so interesting. So gambling is not supposed to be advertised to any audiences that could reasonably draw in people of 18 or younger. However, a research from Goldsmith University found that in a study of 3 episodes of Match of the Day, gambling logos or gambling branding appeared on screen for between 71 and 89% of the show's running time. So when you're a small child with a malleable Play-Doh brain, how are you not going to grow up to think gambling is part and parcel of the football experience?
Well, because it is. I mean, it's undeniable that what these companies set up to do has become reality. It is a part of the matchday experience. There's, as these statistics show, no way to avoid it.
Yeah, absolutely there's not. And obviously we've had more and more of a bespoke experience over the last few years. Derby County got in trouble lately for when Wayne Rooney agreed to join with the club's betting spots. 32 Red agreed that the deal would see him wear the number 32 joining the club. Huddersfield Town, when they had that large Paddy Power logo that came on, which was ostensibly a hoax by Paddy Power to voice their support for no betting sponsors. They got their name into the news more than it usually is, though. And I even read that at Tottenham's ground, the new ground they've just built, you can get free Wi-Fi at the ground, high-speed stuff, but you can only access William Hill. You can't access any other betting websites from it. So football clubs and betting companies are really hand-in-hand with this, and it does start to present the question, we spend all of our time and our emotions supporting these football clubs. If they're turning around and potentially endangering young would-be fans, is that something that's acceptable?
I think that It's not acceptable, but it's something that they won't even be considering. They'll just be looking at the contracts that they're signing, and it'll say that, we want to only be accessible on the Wi-Fi, or you need to make X amount of tweets mentioning us and a specific offer per month.
Mm.
And they'll just sign on the dotted line, and they won't be thinking about it, but it needs to be thought about. Because even these spaces like Twitter, predominantly used by younger fans, and the criticism is correct.
It's interesting you raised as well the focus on championship sides by these betting companies, because it's true that the championship has much more of a prevalent issue, and it's also true that the other 14 teams in the Premier League are the ones who are targeted most by these betting companies. None of the top 6 clubs have a gambling group as a shirt sponsor, although teams like Manchester City and Arsenal have been promoting betting on their social media platforms. But I don't think that this is a complete get out. A lot of these clubs have seen large portions of their revenue come from betting winnings, but you can look at a club like Luton Town, for example, who play in League One, and they have, since 2018, pledged to refuse sponsorship by gambling firms. Their chief executive, Gary Sweet, said, "We don't want to promote excessive gambling behaviour through our support base and our players to our fans," which I think is maybe an enviable stance to take. They don't want to put their fans in a position that they think is ruinous.
Of course, it's an enviable position. It's something that you hope that all clubs will take on, which is that, hey, we're going to look at this, think about it, and be responsible. And there's too much emphasis on the bottom line in football. It's all about money, and you see fans and supporters falling by the wayside at every opportunity. Shirts are so expensive now, and they change every year. Tickets are so expensive now, and it's pricing out a lot of people, and it's also damaging them, because even if you're not going to the games, you're still getting exposed to all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And despite the fact that there's been a quote-unquote voluntary whistle-to-whistle ban on the adverts, it still is on the shirt. So it's whistle-to-whistle in terms of an actual advertising campaign, but you've still got Betway or VBet or something plastered across the front of someone's shirt. Just to wrap up the kids section of it before we get into the slightly more detailed argument about adult gamblers, it's interesting to me to look at the similarity to alcohol advertising laws, because that's one very easy comparison to make, very comparable. A lot of the same rules already exist, obviously not only between alcohol and gambling in this country, where you have to be 18 in either case, but also in alcohol and gambling advertising laws. For example, neither can feature actors who are under the age of 25, which saw a gambling advert pulled because Declan Rice was in it. But what's even more interesting about them is that they're both governed by the UK's Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which I'll be referring to as the DCMS from here on in. And the Labour Party has called for an outright ban. The Labour Party's DCMS, which up until recently was chaired by Tom Watson, has called for a ban on it, saying these companies are making fans feel like they don't have a stake in the game unless they have a bet. So there's at least one large political force in this country that think this is outrageous. There's also legal precedent in terms of alcohol advertising that thinks that children shouldn't be influenced through football into alcohol, and yet betting is still sort of flying under the radar there.
It definitely is, and the reason why it's flying under the radar is because in some ways it's actually potentially more harmful and definitely more accessible for kids than alcohol is, because yes, you can't maybe go into a betting shop to place a bet because you're not over 18, but as you mentioned earlier, you can absolutely do it on your phone, and it doesn't take much to be able to do that. I think I'm quite confident I put on bets when I was under 18, and I don't think I had to try very hard to do so.
Well, this is another thing, and this is sort of part of both conversations, but when you and I were growing up, the iPhone was sort of just becoming a thing, and the Gambling Act of 2005, which is the current thing that is looking at being reviewed now and is what governs betting in this country, was written before the first iPhone went on sale. So we're working in a completely different sphere to what the laws currently govern. And, definitely when we were about 17, 18, betting on your phones was becoming more of a thing. But for a huge part of our childhood, it just wasn't accessible. The reality is, for kids these days, if you're 12, you're 13, you're 14, and you have an iPhone, you might have your dad's credit card just to buy normal apps anyway because you don't have a credit card of your own. Oh, look, all of a sudden you've got a Betfair account. So it's kind of crazy that this is not that difficult, whereas before, it's much like, going to a pub or something, there's someone at the counter who can just say, "Not a chance, kid."
Yeah, exactly. And the other part to discuss is that that's obviously a trend that has been recognized by betting companies, that people now have portable tablets that they can take anywhere with them, and they can bet wherever they want on whatever they want. And they're clearly, exploiting that emerging market. And, should they be held accountable for not being responsible enough in promoting their products to kids?
Yeah, and I think that takes us quite nicely into the second part of this conversation that I'd like to have with you, which I think is a little bit more difficult. I think it's a little bit more... I don't know that there's a definitive correct answer, because some people will feel very strongly one way, some people will feel very strongly another, and I think both have reasonable points. But it's sort of two questions, and it's firstly, is betting itself inherently bad, or is it a legitimate leisure, is it a legitimate thing to do in your downtime? Especially if you're an adult and you have your own agency, and do you have the right to engage with it? And secondly, which kind of feeds into this but is also a question of itself, has betting become more predatory over the last few years with the addition of things specifically like in-game betting and app-based bet, which sort of prey on short-term dopamine hits? So starting with that first one, looking at betting, do you think it's inherently a bad thing? Do you think that everyone should be allowed to bet? Do you think there should be more of a safety net? Or do you think I'm just up about nonsense and any adult should be allowed to do it, and if it goes wrong, on your head be it?
No, I mean, it's hard because we're getting into a really big discussion here, which is basically like, should there be a nanny state? Should, our behavior as adults be regulated by a higher governing authority? And ultimately, I think yes, because that's literally what society is for. We live in a more modern, built-up society because it allows us to protect ourselves from negative influences, from all things that could damage us. I think that betting has the capacity to severely damage us, and it shows in the way that people react to it. There are so many people struggling with it currently in the UK. There are so many people who are recovering from it currently in the UK. And I don't think that betting should be banned outright, but I think that the way that it is done now is predatory, yes, and it should be changed.
I think there's evidence as well that the predatory nature of betting has not only changed, but it's also increased. Just looking at a report from the global betting and gaming consultants in the UK alone, gross gambling yield, which is, for listeners, the sum of bets placed minus winnings, which is, in other words, just the money that these companies have gained, rose from football alone from £908 million in the 2015 financial year to £1.4 billion in the 2016 financial year. It's continued to increase further and further, although I haven't had the football-only proportion, but gambling in general has massively, massively increased over the last few financial years, largely also due to this year, everyone being in their house and bored and wanting to put in a bet. But the amount of money being put into the gambling sector has exploded, and definitely, given the fact that the general wealth of the country hasn't exploded, that would suggest that people are putting a larger and larger proportion of their own personal finance into gambling.
Yeah, exactly. Entirely right. I think there was a report that I saw back from July of 2020 where British people lost £228 million in 1 month, which is an increase of 25% from the year before. So yeah, absolutely astronomical numbers, and it doesn't look like it's changing anytime soon. It's not something that is, while it hasn't increased this year, it's not something that is limited only to this year. It has been increasing year on year.
It definitely does worry me, because I think, I'm someone who used to enjoy a bet on football. I was betting on football all the way up until I started working in an FA capacity, so couldn't anymore, but really enjoyed it, and I think everyone should have the right to bet, but I do also think there should be intelligent advertising surrounding it. I'm not here to say, we should lock betting and be one of those countries that makes gambling illegal, but there does need to be an intelligent way to apply it. Peter Shilton came out this week, which was really, really interesting to see him come out.
Yeah, I saw this.
Talked about how we need to end the conspiracy of silence on gambling. Shilton himself was a sufferer of gambling addiction for 45 years and has now launched a campaign called Shilton's Shirt Gambling Ban to kick gambling advertising out of football. And he talks about how all these sort of ex-professionals and current professionals, there's kind of just this conspiracy of silence. And what he means by that is there's a known problem that people can acknowledge, but it's not really addressed because of multiple reasons, because it brings in so much money to the sport, because these companies hold sway, Like, hell, even when we were talking about the Kieran Trippier thing the other week, we talked about how Ladbrokes are a partner of the Premier League when some of the gambling rules were written up. These things are dodgy, and yet they're openly dodgy because there's enough money in the system. I think that, broadly, everyone would agree that the last thing you want is people to be swindled out of their cash. But at the same time, because betting has this sort of like almost family friendly, which is weird to say about betting, but like appearance, it gets endorsed. And, the Premier League officially doesn't even oppose it. Richard Masters, who is the CEO of the Premier League, as we mentioned previously in episodes, he came out last year and said that as a whole, the betting situation needs further regulation, but he doesn't necessarily think that the answer should be that clubs should no longer have betting partnerships. So even when push comes to shove and asked directly, the Premier League's stance is that betting partnerships are okay. So this is something that would need to be a government regulation as compared to something within the sport.
And it should be a government regulation because they have a responsibility to us as, members of the public. It's definitely something that appears in family life, even just through, buying a football shirt for your kid. It's got a logo on the front. Something you can do about that. The kid wants the shirt, and you want to give it to him. So even in that sense, you're passing off advertising to your own child.
And potentially to others, because people always say, like footballers are walking billboards because they wear a shirt with the company on the front of it. That is also true of anyone who wears a replica shirt.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not sustainable at the moment. I completely agree with you. It's a contributing factor in terms of the money that goes into clubs, but it's not good enough that football is currently defined by gambling, at least in part. We need to, push towards divesting ourselves away from harmful behaviors and towards, more manageable ones.
I think it's one of those things that's quite interesting because these things are changed by big moments. So we might look back at this Gary Lineker thing in 5-10 years and go, oh, that's where it all started, the whole sort of big personalities coming out, because the Peter Shilton thing, to my knowledge, came out after Gary Lineker's statement. I could be wrong there, but certainly they came within a few weeks of each other. But these things sort of are all happening. So maybe it'll pick up speed, or maybe it'll be something that, and I hope this isn't the case, that we look back on in a few years and it's a bit too late and everyone's 7-year-old son has lost a house because he's gambled it away on an accumulator. But I suppose we'll see. It's definitely one to keep in mind. I think it's a very nuanced discussion because this isn't meant to be a very openly critical, like, oh, betting bad and anyone who bets is a moron. Like, there's a lot to consider, and there is a place for betting in football, but I think that place is being overstepped at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think the main distinction to make is that what we're talking about is unregulated markets, unregulated betting, and harmful tactics in terms of advertising and in terms of encouragement. So yeah, definitely. I mean, personally, I do still put on the occasional bet, but I'm also very fortunate that I've never experienced it take over my life, and I feel lucky for that, because it can happen very easily, and the stories that you hear about people that fall down rabbit holes and even end up killing themselves at young ages, that they'll have received one email from the company asking if they're okay. And that level of pastoral care is just not acceptable, because they have such an influence on people's lives that they should not be allowed to just be so irresponsible.
Yeah, very well put. And I think a good place to wrap it up